This is question 3 of paper 1 of the 2017 AS biology examination. I love this question because I love the diagram. I actually use this diagram when I'm teaching 6.10 absorption of the products of digestion, which is another video. And generally the question exemplifies the point that although you're learning about biology, you've got to be explicit. You've got to be specific. When you're talking about triglycerides, you're talking about triglycerides and not lipids. Let's have a read through and recap about what we know. Using the diagram, we know that the lumen of the small intestine is an aqueous environment. And that poses several challenges to the digestion of fat because fat and water or aqueous environments are immiscible. They do not mix. So for that reason, when you've ingested a large lump of lipid or fat, you use bile to break it down into smaller droplets, lipid droplets. And the lipid droplets have an increased surface area overall for the action of the enzyme lipase. Straightforward so far, not much uplift from GCSE. We know that the action of the bile increases the surface area of the lipid droplets for the hydrolysis of triglycerides. As we follow the diagram, we can see that the lipid or the triglyceride is hydrolyzed into fatty acids and glycerol. Now they are still not wanting to mix with the watery environment. And so bile salts stay in association with those molecules until they reach the intestinal epithelial wall. Otherwise, they would clump back together, and we don't want that because it would then be too large to pass into the intestinal epithelial cell. Once the micelles are at the intestinal epithelial cell membrane, the bile salts can dissociate, they break away, and the fatty acids and glycerol are free to diffuse across that lipid membrane and into the cell. Now this is where we have information missing from our diagram. The next stage that we see in our diagram is that the triglycerides are in a vesicle. Clearly something has been missed out because the triglycerides are now triglycerides. In other words, fatty acids and glycerol have been built back up and also they've been packaged into a vesicle. Where did that happen? Once the fatty acids and glycerol entered the intestinal epithelial cell, they went to the endoplasmic reticulum. That is where they were built back up into triglycerides and packaged into a vesicle. But that stage of the process has been left out, and later on in the question you find that they only actually want to know about the Golgi apparatus. In the Golgi apparatus, protein and cholesterol are added to the triglycerides and they are packaged into a vesicle for export from the cell by exocytosis. From there they enter the lymph capillary that forms part of the lacteal that supplies the villus. Looking at the question, it wants to know the process by which fatty acids and glycerol enter the intestinal epithelial cell. Clearly that's diffusion because lipid-soluble substances can just diffuse across plasma membranes. The next question says, explain the advantages of lipid droplet and micelle formation. In other words, why do we make lipid droplets and why do we make micelles? 2 questions and only 3 marks. It shouldn't be too difficult. Take a minute to break the question down into its constituent parts. So the first thing we're going to say is that droplets increase the surface area for the enzyme lipase. Again, we're being obvious. We're not just saying that droplets increase the surface area. We need to say why that helps, why that gives an advantage. So that's when we're going to say that there is then faster hydrolysis of triglycerides. Now you can see there, first of all, I wrote faster digestion, but we're at A level. Let's show that we're at A level and not at GCSE. We can't just say so that there is hydrolysis of triglycerides because even if we didn't have small droplets of lipid, we would get some hydrolysis of triglycerides. So it's the idea that it's faster. Many students wrote there so that there is better hydrolysis or better digestion. Better doesn't equal faster, so don't lose marks on that. 3.7% of students scored all 3 marks in this question, and that was one of the main reasons why. We've now said 2 things about the lipid. Let's talk about the micelle. Well, the micelle carry fatty acids and glycerol to the membrane of the epithelial cell. That's all the mark scheme wanted. If I'd been answering that question, I would have been tempted to write a little bit more because I would have wanted to talk about the advantage of the micelle. I probably would have talked about how the micelle maintained the fatty acids and glycerol in small units because they were in an aqueous environment. As it turned out, they didn't want that, but I think that is a misuse of the word advantage in the actual question when it says explain the advantage of micelle formation. The other reason why students lost lots of marks is because they didn't recognise the question as two questions. They simply referred to it or they and lumped the lipid droplet and the micelle formation together in their answer. So I know teachers have been telling you since you were in year 1 to read the question, but how about breaking that question up? How about getting a pen and scribbling on that question and breaking it down into its parts? Okay, looking at the last part of the question, name structure Q in figure 2 and suggest how it's involved in the absorption of lipids. Okay, well, 1 mark for mentioning that it is the golgi apparatus. How is it involved? Okay, well, remember, it modifies triglycerides. It doesn't modify fatty acids and glycerol. Triglycerides enter the golgi because they've come from the endoplasmic reticulum. Once inside, it combines triglycerides with proteins and cholesterol, and it packages the modified triglyceride into vesicles. In the examiner's report, it talks about how a lot of students didn't use the diagram to help them. You can see it's the triglyceride entering the Golgi apparatus, so don't say it's anything else. The examiner's report also made reference to a lot of students writing generic answers. You've got to keep referring to the stem of the question. Don't just write everything you know about the Golgi apparatus. 70% of students only got 1 mark, and that's because they only named the Golgi. They then wrote generic answers instead of writing what happened in this case, in this cell, with these triglycerides. So don't forget to carve up the questions as you move through them. Also, make sure you know what a chylomicron is, make sure you know what a micelle is, make sure you know what a lipid is, and make sure you know what the difference between the 3 are. As always, I hope the video has been of use. Please do leave me a comment.